When Donald Trump first came down the golden escalator at Trump Tower to announce his presidential campaign in 2015, his message was blunt that American workers were losing out because of terrible trade deals. Trump promised to flip the script, to fight for American industries, and to use tariffs as a weapon to restore national greatness. During his first term, from 2017 to 2021, Trump transformed U.S. trade policy and abandoned decades of bipartisan consensus that free trade was overall beneficial. He brought tariffs back into the center of American economic strategy, a place they had not occupied since the early 20th century. Trump's first major move came early in 2018. Trump placed a 25% tariff on imported steel and a 10% tariff on aluminum and invoked Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962. He justified it on grounds of national security and argued that American industrial strength was vital for military readiness. The move was controversial even among allies. Countries like Canada, Germany, and South Korea, who were longtime U.S. partners, were outraged. Even Republican leaders in Congress, who are traditionally known as free trade advocates, had concerns. But Trump remained defiant and believed tariffs were a necessary corrective. Shortly afterwards, Trump launched an even bigger confrontation, a trade war with China. The administration accused China of unfair trade practices, including intellectual property theft, forced technology transfers, and industrial espionage. Under Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974, Trump imposed tariffs on $34 billion worth of Chinese goods. China retaliated with its own tariffs on American soybeans, pork, and cars. The tit-for-tat escalation increased until hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods were entangled. Trump also used tariffs as leverage beyond Asia. In mid-2019, he threatened Mexico with sweeping tariffs unless it cracked down on illegal immigration. The tariffs were ultimately suspended after the negotiations, but the threat alone showcased Trump's broader strategy, which said that trade was no longer just about economics. It was about immigration, national security, and even foreign policy. Behind all these actions was a distinct worldview, which was a radical split from post-war American economic orthodoxy. Since World War II, both Republican and Democratic administrations had championed global free trade and believed that open markets would spread prosperity and make the U.S. leadership stronger in the world. But Trump and his closest advisors have rejected that model. Peter Navarro, Trump's trade advisor and a key architect of tariff policy, had long argued that free trade was a myth. In his books, such as Death by China and Crouching Tiger, What China's Militarism Means for the World, Navarro depicted trade deficits not as benign reflections of consumer choice, but as signs of national decline. According to Navarro and like-minded thinkers, every dollar Americans spent on imports was a dollar lost to foreign competitors. The losses of manufacturing jobs were not seen as unavoidable consequences of automation or shifting economies, but they were portrayed as the direct result of bad trade deals, foreign cheating, and elite betrayal. Another major influence was Robert Lighthizer, Trump's United States trade representative. Though quieter and more methodical than Navarro, Lighthizer also believed that America's industrial base was essential for strategic reasons and had been systematically undermined by globalization. Pat Buchanan, the populist conservative commentator and former presidential candidate, was another intellectual forefather of Trump's approach. For decades, Buchanan had severely criticized the outsourcing of American jobs, the rise of China, and what he called the hollowing out of American manufacturing towns. Trump absorbed these ideas deeply. He usually spoke nostalgically about America's mid-20th century industrial dominance and pledged to recreate it through protectionism, tariffs, and renegotiated trade agreements. Supporters of Trump's approach argued that tariffs served many purposes. They would protect American workers from unfair competition. They would rebuild critical industries needed for national security. They would reduce America's chronic trade deficits, which Trump viewed almost as moral failings. And they would send a clear signal that the United States would no longer tolerate exploitation by foreign powers. But to truly understand the significance of Trump's tariff revolution, we must place it in historical context. Tariffs have a long, controversial history in American and world economic policy. In the 19th century, the United States was one of the world's most protectionist countries. The Tariff of 1828, known to its critics as the Tariff of Abominations, raised rates to historically high levels to protect northern manufacturers at the expense of southern agricultural exporters. Later, the McKinley Tariff of 1890 and the Fordney-McCumber Tariff of 1922 maintained America's status as a high-tariff economy. These policies were widely credited with helping American industries grow, but they also contributed to economic tensions internationally. The most famous historical example was the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930. It was enacted at the start of the Great Depression, and it raised U.S. tariffs to record levels on thousands of imports. The result was disastrous. American trading partners retaliated, world trade collapsed by 2/3, and the global economic crisis deepened. Trump's tariffs drew immediate comparisons to Smoot-Hawley, though his supporters insisted that the circumstances were different. America was no longer a manufacturing powerhouse needing protection, but a deindustrialized nation looking for a revival. Beyond America, other powers have also used tariffs aggressively. In the 18th and 19th centuries, Britain famously maintained steep protectionist tariffs before shifting toward free trade after the repeal of the Corn Laws in 1846. Germany under Bismarck introduced protectionist policies to shield its growing industries from British competition. In the 20th century, Japan used a mixture of tariffs, subsidies, and trade barriers to build its industrial base during its post-war economic miracle. Even modern China, despite its embrace of global trade, maintains a complex web of non-tariff barriers and state-directed industrial policy aimed at protecting key sectors. Trump's tariffs, therefore, are part of a long historical tradition which is the use of state power to shape trade flows, nurture industries, and protect national interests. What makes Trump's approach unique is its timing and scale. In an era when most nations profess to believe in free markets, Trump unapologetically embraced tariffs as a central pillar of economic nationalism. By the time Trump left office in January 2021, he had succeeded in reshaping America's trade posture. NAFTA had been replaced with the USMCA. Tariffs on hundreds of billions of dollars worth of goods remained in place. And the Republican Party, once the party of free trade, had largely come to accept tariffs as part of its new identity. But that was only the beginning. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he moved even faster and much more aggressively. Trump believed that he now had a mandate to go even further than before. The second Trump administration wasted no time escalating America's use of tariffs as the primary instrument of economic, political, and even strategic policy. Within his first 100 days, Trump imposed a series of sweeping tariffs. Between January and April 2025, the average effective U.S. tariff rate rose from just 2.5% to an estimated 27%. It is the highest level in more than a century. The most dramatic moment came on the 2nd of April 2025, a date Trump called Liberation Day. That day, he announced a 10% minimum tariff on all U.S. imports, regardless of origin. For imports from 57 countries, tariffs would rise even higher, and some reaching up to 50%. Trump's reciprocal tariff policy was based on a simple, yet heavily criticized, formula: the larger the trade deficit the United States had with a country, the higher the tariff. Economists immediately pointed out flaws. The formula didn't account for the reasons behind trade deficits or the structure of modern supply chains. It ignored services trade and investment flows. Still, Trump and his advisors insisted it was a fair correction after decades of exploitation. China, once again, was the primary target. Trump raised baseline tariffs on Chinese imports to a staggering 145%. China retaliated by slapping 125% tariffs on American goods and restricting exports of critical rare earth minerals essential for high-tech industries. Meanwhile, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on steel, aluminum, automobiles, and automotive parts from nearly all countries. Even U.S. allies like Canada and Mexico were hit, though USMCA-compliant goods initially received exemptions. The administration invoked emergency powers under the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to bypass Congress and enact these tariffs swiftly. Trump's declaration of multiple national emergencies, ranging from trade deficits to energy independence, allowed him to consolidate authority over trade policy like never before. Domestically, the tariffs caused immediate economic shock. The stock market plunged in early April, triggering what some analysts called the start of the 2025 recession. The Federal Reserve and OECD downgraded U.S. growth forecasts sharply. Facing backlash, Trump agreed to pause tariffs above 10% for all countries except China for 90 days. Nevertheless, the 10% baseline tariff remained, and the 25% sector-specific tariffs continued to apply broadly. Beyond China, Trump reignited conflicts with Canada and Mexico. After accusing him of failing to restrict illegal immigration and drug trafficking, he imposed new 25% tariffs, including on auto imports. Canada retaliated with billions of dollars worth of tariffs against U.S. goods. Mexico deployed thousands of troops to its northern border in a bid to make peace with Trump, but tensions remained high. Trump's second term also introduced a new weapon, that is, secondary tariffs, modeled on secondary sanctions. Countries that continued trading with targeted nations like Venezuela, Russia, or Iran faced penalties themselves. In March 2025, Trump authorized a 25% tariff on nations buying Venezuelan oil, and later threatened similar tariffs against countries purchasing Russian oil. The administration took aim at the digital economy as well. Trump ordered investigations into the European Union's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act, warning that US tech companies were being unfairly targeted and hinting at retaliatory tariffs. India, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, and Singapore all found themselves under new tariff pressure. India, long labeled by Trump as the tariff king, faced a 27% reciprocal tariff. Japan's stock market tumbled after Trump imposed tariffs on Japanese cars and auto parts. Taiwan, despite being a key US ally against China, faced a 32% tariff on goods excluding semiconductors. Even Israel, one of America's closest allies, was not spared. Trump imposed a 17% tariff on Israeli goods after trade talks failed to satisfy his demands. Amid this global trade upheaval, Trump's economic advisors, including Peter Navarro, Scott Bessent, and Kevin Hassett, clashed behind the scenes over strategy. Some pushed for more surgical tariffs aimed at negotiation leverage. Navarro and his camp favored permanent, across-the-board tariffs to transform trade patterns permanently. By late April 2025, Trump's tariffs remained largely in place despite attempts to negotiate partial rollbacks. Polling showed that while Trump's core supporters cheered the hardline stance, the broader American public grew increasingly concerned about rising prices, supply chain disruptions, and recession risks. Bloomberg Economics estimated that even with partial pauses, the average US tariff rate would stay above 24% for the foreseeable future. Opposition to Trump's trade policies. Critics of Trump's approach have been severely critical. They pointed out that tariffs are taxes paid by American consumers and businesses, not foreign governments. They warned that retaliation from other countries would hurt American exporters, especially farmers. They argued that trade deficits were largely driven by macroeconomic forces like savings rates and currency flows, and not unfair trade practices. Over time, the critics seemed to gain ammunition. Studies showed that Trump's tariffs raised costs for US manufacturers. American farmers suffered from Chinese retaliation, and despite the trade war, America's overall trade deficit did not shrink significantly. Still, for many of Trump's supporters, the tariffs were less about measurable outcomes and more about symbolism. They represented a rejection of an economic order that many Americans felt had failed them. While Trump's focus on reviving American manufacturing resonated deeply with many voters, the reality of industrial decline is more complex than the story told by tariff advocates. Empirical evidence strongly suggests that automation, not trade, has been the greatest factor behind manufacturing job losses in the United States. According to a widely cited study by Hicks and DeVerage, automation and productivity gains explained about 88% of manufacturing job losses between 2000 and 2010. In other words, machines, not foreign competition, displaced the majority of factory workers. Moreover, US manufacturing output actually increased in absolute terms by roughly 20% between 2000 and 2020, despite the employment decline. This means that American factories were producing more goods than ever, but with fewer workers to do the job. Other research supports this view. The trade model developed by economists Caliendo, Dvorkin, and Paro showed that the so-called China shock, which is the surge of Chinese imports into the US market, only accounted for about 15% of the observed decline in US manufacturing employment between 2000 and 2007. In their view, foreign competition played a role, but it was far from the whole story. Beyond automation and trade, the structure of the American economy itself has shifted in important ways. Over the past several decades, the United States moved toward a service-driven economy. Finance, healthcare, education, technology, and professional services have become the new engines of growth. Household spending patterns have followed this shift, with American consumers spending less proportionally on manufactured goods and more on services like travel, health, entertainment, and education. Cultural shifts have compounded these economic changes. Younger generations usually seek careers in white-collar fields and favor knowledge-intensive work over traditional manufacturing roles. Physical labor jobs, once seen as a path to the middle class, are increasingly perceived as less desirable or offering fewer opportunities for upward mobility. Trump's narrative focuses on the deficit in goods trade, the imbalance between what America imports and exports in physical products. Critics say he ignores a crucial fact that the United States runs a substantial trade surplus in services, exporting finance, technology, consulting, intellectual property, and creative industries to the world. The manufacturing job decline is real. But Trump's critics argue that it is the product of many forces: automation, economic evolution, cultural change, and shifting global demand. So, trade imbalances, while important, are only part of the picture. Economists who are questioning Trump's logic say that these problems cannot be resolved through simple, tariff-based remedies. Tariffs might protect certain sectors temporarily, but they cannot reverse deep technological or cultural currents that have reshaped the American economy over decades. Trump's tariffs, then, might be about politics more than economics. They are about a real sense of loss, a yearning for an America where factory jobs anchored communities and prosperity. But whether tariffs can restore that world, or whether they will merely impose new costs on a transformed economy, remains an unanswered question of his trade revolution. Donald Trump's tariff strategy, across both presidencies, has challenged the assumptions that guided U.S. trade policy for decades. In his view, trade is war, an arena where the strong dictates the terms, and where loyalty to the sentiments of American workers is more important than free market orthodoxy. For his critics, the tariffs are economic self-harm, isolationism, and a retreat from global leadership. For his supporters, they are the biggest fulfillment of his promise to put America first.